The next topic we need to get into is the way scope works in JavaScript. And this is an important thing to understand because in JavaScript, when JavaScript was originally written, you have to keep in mind that they really thought that it was going to be very short scripts that were used on web pages to do some interactive things, and that was about it. They didn't expect JavaScript to become a general all-purpose programming language at that point. So scope was not really very big of a concern, but JavaScript has become a general programming language, and scope is now a pretty big concern, and we need to be careful about it. And this is another thing in the language that is potentially problematic and that you want to be really clear about and have some best practices around so you don't make mistakes and get unexpected results and spend a lot of time chasing down bugs in your code, because that's no fun. So let's talk about how scope works. If we look at this script over here, and I'm actually going to switch to my code editor over here, so I have this written over here. I have a variable called a variable, and it's in the global scope. It's not defined, it's defined within the script tag, but it's not defined within any sort of function. And then I have a variable also called a variable in the local scope. And then I'm going to run test scope, this function here, which should print out this variable. And then I'm going to console log out a variable, which should print out that variable. Let's see if that actually works. I'm going to open a new tab here and do Control-O and open up scope and click open. And we get that. And I'm going to do inspect. And I'm going to move this thing down to the bottom and click on console. And you can see this is in the local scope and this is in the global scope. So I have two variables with the same name with two different values. And that's kind of bad. It's not really a great thing to have happen there. But you can do that kind of thing with JavaScript. And it's not great. So what does local scope mean? Well, let's do this for a second. Let's go ahead and take this out of here and then run that file again. Now, this one's running because it's inside the local scope, but the one that says this says a variable is not defined. Because what happens here is that I cannot access, if this variable doesn't exist, I can't access this one from outside this function because this variable is only accessible within the scope of this function. And so that's what local scope means, is that it's local to inside the function and I can't access it outside the function. And that can be very important for making sure that we don't have problems with our variables. Okay, great. Even worse, this is what happens when things get even worse. In JavaScript, and we've seen this before, is if I make a variable and I forget to use the var keyword, that variable automatically becomes part of the global scope. So I'm going to go ahead and add this in here and see what happens. I'm going to make another variable called oops global, but I'm not going to use the var keyword equals, quote, this is accidentally global. And then down here, you'll notice I can access that variable, even though it's defined, kind of defined, because I didn't use the var keyword. It's not really defined inside the function. It belongs to the window. So now you'll notice when I run this over here, this one runs. So I couldn't access the local scope variable because it was inside the function, but because I forgot to use the var keyword here, if I put var in front of this, that will no longer be global and we'll get that error happening again. So this is kind of This is kind of a bad thing in JavaScript, is that you could accidentally leave out var, just a keyword, and the variable will still be defined, but it'll be defined at the wrong scope level. And that could lead to all kinds of problems. One strategy that we can use to deal with the global scope and trying to prevent problems there is to just never use the global scope whenever possible. So here you can see I have a very simple script that is doing what we've done before. It's going in to our document, getting our paragraphs, and then using a loop to change all the color for each paragraph to red in that loop one at a time. It's going through and looping that. But here, my P's is in the global scope, the variable I is in the global scope, all of this stuff is in the global scope. So that could be problematic. So what can we do about that to keep it out of the global scope? One thing we can do is we can use what's called an IIFE, or an immediately invoked function expression. Basically, we wrap all of that stuff inside of a function that will just run automatically when the page loads. So we could take all our script and stick it inside of one of these sort of self-running functions, and it will just run and do its thing inside the function. And it'll keep the variables local to that function. So let's take a look at how to do this really quickly. Over here, I have my script, and you can see that I'm getting my paragraphs, and I've got my for loop here, and it's going through and doing that kind of thing. And then if I come back here and actually run this thing, you can see that it's actually turning these paragraphs red. So that's all working and working as expected. The way to use the IIFE, the immediately invoked function expression, is like this. We type a set of parentheses, and then inside the parentheses, we put a function, which has its own parentheses and its own curly braces. And then we add one more set of parentheses to force it to run. And we can put a semicolon at the end of that. And then when we click in here, we can actually take this entire thing and stick it inside of that function. There we go. And now that function will run when the page loads. So if I come over and refresh it, you'll see it just runs and it works just the same as before. But what's different now is that these variables are now local to this function and they're not in the global space. So down here, if I do console.log my P's, I'm going to get an error, which is what I want. I want to make sure that I cannot access the variable my P's in the global scope. So if I do that and then come back over here and run this again, it'll run fine. But if I inspect, you'll see in the console, I'm getting an error. My P's is not defined because it's not in the global scope. So again, I'm going to do that one more time because the syntax is just terrible, but it really is helpful for making sure everything stays in the local scope there of this function. So I'm going to get rid of that again. And I'm going to just do this one more time. So we start with a pair of parentheses, and in there we add a function with its parentheses and its curly braces. And then to make it run immediately, we put another set of parentheses like that. And I'm going to just put a semicolon at the end. And then this is what's going to hold all our code. So we put that in between the curly braces, move that down, and then all of this stuff can just go inside here. Like so. And once you've typed this function expression a few times, you'll get comfortable with it. and then that will work just fine. And it keeps everything local to this function expression. There are a few more things that I want to say about this while we're here. This is also called namespacing because we are making sure that the space for the name for this variable is set so that it's within this function. So that's actually a namespacing thing. And namespacing has to do with where things are available. Another thing to point out is that any function in JavaScript is a closure, really. All functions are closures. Anything that you put inside of a function is going to keep those variables from creeping out into the global scope, unless you forget the var keyword. And we'll get to a fix for that in a minute. But that's an important thing. And often when we talk about closures in JavaScript, if you look it up on YouTube, closures in JavaScript, although technically any function is a closure, really what people are talking about, usually when they're talking about closures, is not just keeping the variables local to the function, but also being able to get data out of those closures as well. And we're not talking about that part at this point. We'll deal with that in a more advanced course. But here, we're just looking at how do we keep the variables inside the closure for this particular function here. How do we keep it inside there so that it doesn't pollute the global scope? And that's the terminology that we use, polluting the global scope. And one of the reasons why we don't want to pollute the global scope is we could be combining scripts from other people, and they could have variables with the same names. And then these variables could collide with each other, and you could get unexpected results because you think a variable is holding one value, but in fact, it's holding another because it's coming from another script because they didn't keep their variable values local and they let them creep into the global scope. Those are some of the problems that you can run into with more complex scripts. So there's that. One last thing I want to go over really quickly here about the immediately invoked function expressions is we can make a function. Here I have my doStuff function back again, and I can call it this way with doStuff. But any function can be immediately invoked. So if I comment out doStuff here, that's not going to do anything. It's just going to define the function. But I could put a parenthesis in front of this and a parenthesis at the end of it, and then a set of parentheses and a semicolon. And now that function will run. doStuff will run right off the bat without having to actually call it like this. So this is an immediately invoked function as well. So if I do that and then come over here, save that, and then come over here and test it, you'll see it runs just fine and it does everything it needs to do. However, we're using the anonymous function here, this anonymous function here, just as an anonymous function that will just automatically run. And I have that page open over here in the MDN for the IIFE, the immediately invoked function expression, which will explain more about how this works and what it does. It's kind of a useful technique that we have at our disposal. Okay, great. We'll look at the next thing in the next video. The first strategy was to use some sort of closure with namespacing to make sure that variables stay out of the global scope. The second strategy is to use this useStrict directive. And this is something that came out as part of ES5, which again came out in 2009, because it was recognized fairly early on that the issue of forgetting to use the var keyword when defining a new variable is really very problematic, or potentially very problematic. So we want to have that not happen. And let's take a look at how this works, because this is kind of interesting. So over here, I have a variable, and I didn't put var here like that. So I've left off the keyword. So this new var is going to get defined in the global scope. And it is in the global scope anyway, because we're not inside of a function, but that's okay. We can do this, and we can console log that out. And I can save that and go over and run it over here in my browser, and you'll see that that variable gets sent out to the console log as described there, which is fine. But if I add the use strict directive in here, use strict, like so. And this is a directive. So we put that in there, and then watch what happens. If I come over and try to run this script again. Uncut reference error, new var is not defined. So use strict will keep me from accidentally forgetting the var keyword. If I put that in, it'll work just fine. There we go. Now, again, this was something that came out as part of ES5 back in 2009, and that's kind of a very interesting and useful tool to keep us from doing this. And if we combine these two things together, the IIFE or the closure, if we make sure that everything is enclosed inside of a function, and the use strict directive, if we do those two things together, we'll be making really big progress towards making sure that our variables are staying within the proper scope for our functions and everything. So that's really great. And as you go forward with working with scripts, I strongly recommend that you use both of these two things. And I'm going to give you sort of an exercise that will help you with practicing this in just a few minutes. I just want to show you one more strategy that's going to help us with scope before we do that. The third strategy that will help us with keeping track of scope is to use const and let as keywords for defining variables instead of var. So const and let were introduced into the language. They were added to the language as part of ES6 or ES 2015. And they both help to minimize the chances that a variable holds an unexpected value. Const will hold a value, but once you've set the value for a variable, you cannot change the value of that variable while the script runs. So that will keep you from accidentally reassigning a value to a variable that has been defined using the const keyword. So here I've got const cheese equals yummy. And now that that's been set, while the script runs, it cannot be changed. The let keyword allows you to change the variable, but it has block level scope. So here, let I equals 0, that I is only available as a variable inside this for loop block, and it won't be available outside of the for loop block. So that adds a third level of scope to JavaScript. Previously, we had the global scope, and we had scope inside functions, but we didn't have any block level scope. Now we've got a block level scope. Let's take a look at a couple of these examples. First, let's look at const. So here I have cheese equals yummy, and I can console log that out. But if I try to assign a different value to cheese, I'm going to get an error. Let's just see. I have that over here in my code editor here, and that's great. So we can try to run that and see what we get. When I run that over here, what I get is uncut type error, assignment to constant variable. Cheese is yummy ran, that ran fine, but I could not assign a new value to that variable without getting an error. And that's going to keep me from accidentally assigning a new value to that variable when I don't want to, or I want to make sure it doesn't change. So that's going to really help. The next thing we can look at is the the let keyword and using that instead of var. And we'll do this with a for loop. So let's go over to our code editor and put this one in really quickly. I'm going to just make a quick for loop here, for. And instead of using var I, I'm going to use let I equals 0. Oops, 0, not O. Let I equals 0, while I is less than 10, something like that. Let's do it like that. There we go. I plus plus. And then curly braces console.log I. And if I test this, you'll see that I will get printed out 10 times. That's as expected. So that's working just the same way as as var. But if I come back here, if I try to do console.log, use my tick marks, the value of I is I, but make that a variable, $, curly brace. That's going to generate an error because I've used the let keyword and this has block level scope. Let's see that in action. I is not defined. Whereas if I were to come back here and change this keyword to var, that doesn't have block level scope. So if I save that, the value of I is 10 because it's gone through the whole loop and it got up to 10. So with var, we don't have block level scope, but with let, we do. So with our third strategy here, what we should do is never use var to define variables anymore. Instead, we can use const or let. And in general, use const whenever you can. Use const by default. And then if you actually have to have a variable change values, like you will in a loop, then you can use let. But mostly stick with const as much as possible. One last thing I want to talk about before we're done with talking about scope is hoisting in JavaScript. And this has to do with where variables and functions are defined. Generally speaking, functions and variables get hoisted in JavaScript, meaning JavaScript looks at the file and it sees that variables have been used, so it hoists them up to the top, as well as functions as well get hoisted up to the top. Let's see an example of this really quickly. So for example, if I use the var keyword to define cheese, but I console log cheese out first, see what happens. So over here in my code editor, I have console log cheese, and then I'm defining the variable after I'm trying to run it in the console. Notice what I get over here. If I refresh this page, I get undefined because the variable has not been defined at the point at which I'm using it, but it knows it exists because of the hoisting. Whereas if I change that variable declaration there to const, watch what happens. Now I get an error. And you may be thinking, why would I want an error? Well, really, what we're trying to avoid is unexpected results. And if you can explicitly get an error that says that it didn't get called right, then that's better than getting something that's undefined or something that's unexpected. So in this case, even though we don't really want errors, it helps us identify problems in our scripts before they become big problems and bugs that are difficult to track down. Great. So with that, you've learned a lot about the scope in JavaScript and the different strategies for dealing with scope in JavaScript. And they include, first and foremost, using some sort of closure or namespacing with the immediately invoked function expression to keep variables out of the global scope. That's number one. Number two, use the useStrict declaration to do that and keep that going. And then number three, or the useStrict will keep us from having variables that are accidentally declared without using the var keyword or any keyword from going into the global scope. And then number three, use const and let as keywords to define variables. Those three strategies together will really help with making sure your scripts are more bulletproof and less prone to bugs and mistakes. The scope techniques that we just discussed take some getting used to. So I really strongly recommend you do this exercise to help you get used to them and get comfortable with them. Previously, you had done some event challenges, and I have that folder over here. So I have a folder here with challenges 22 through 30, and hopefully you have those as well, with all the completed challenges in there. If you don't, you should go do those challenges first. Then I have my code editor here. I'm going to open that folder in my code editor by clicking folder, open folder, and I can open my event challenges folder here, and it will show up on the side over here. So that's great. Next, what I'm going to do is practice these best practices around scope and around some stuff around file management as well, and working with scripts and files. So here I have my challenge 22 challenge that I did with the script at the bottom of the page. What I want to do is I want to move the script off of the bottom of the page to a separate linked file, and I want to make use of my best practices around the immediately invoked function expression that runs automatically, as well as the useStrict directive that will keep me from accidentally having variables that don't have a keyword starting them. And then I want to switch my keywords from var to either const or let wherever I possibly can. So let's do that. Over here, I'm going to make a new file, and you can click this button here to make a new file. This one makes a new folder, so be aware of the differences there. I'm going to make a new file. I'm going to call it script22.js to go with this, to go with challenge 22 here. And on script22.js, I'm going to start by adding my immediately invoked function expression by starting with the parentheses, and then I'm going to put in here a function with its parentheses and curly braces. And then don't forget, I need one more set of parentheses to make that actually run. Okay, so I've got a function here. And in here, I'm going to add the useStrict directive. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to challenge 22 here, and I'm going to come down to the bottom, and I'm going to copy or cut. I can actually just cut Command X or Control X, cut this script right from here, and instead I'm going to paste it in here like that. Might have to Shift Tab to move that over. All right, great. So that's here. And maybe I don't need that part so much. That's fine. The next thing I want to do is replace any variable declarations so that they're not using the var keyword. They're using either const or let. Use const wherever you possibly can, and use let where you have to. So this can be const, and this can be const. Why? Because I'm going into my document and getting these elements out of the document. That's not going to change during the running of the script. So that's all fine. That's great. So I've done my three things. I'm using my function expression here, my immediately invoked function expression as a closure. And then I'm using the useStrict directive to, if I had forgotten to put const here, that will catch that problem and tell me explicitly that I've done a bad thing. And I've changed my variables declarations from using var to const. Now, over here in my file, instead of having the script here, I'm going to add a source, src equals, and then I can actually put in here script 22. And that's fine. And I can move this up to here, really. So you have to keep the closing tag, but that will work. And now I can come over to my file in the browser over here, refresh, test it, and you can see it still works. It still functions just fine. Even more, if you want to, you could even take this even further by moving the declaration for the script here up to the top of the file. I can put it in here in the head, but I have to add the defer keyword here. With defer, it will make it run as if it's at the bottom of the page. And you'll see that still works. If I take defer out of there, watch what happens. Refresh. And it doesn't work because add event listener of null. It's what's going on here is that the page loads from the top to the bottom. So it's loading the script first before it gets to the button. And on this script, it's saying, put an event listener on the button. Well, I can't put an event listener on a button that doesn't exist yet. But adding the defer keyword up here, what that does is it makes it so that it loads that script after the rest of the page is loaded. So that will work just fine. So you can go through the rest of these and you'll create a new file for script 23.js. And you'll do the same thing on this one. On challenge 23, you'll notice that can be const, that can be const. This down here has to be let. That'll have to be let. Go through and put in const and let wherever there's a var. Use const as much as you can, and only use let where the variable actually has to change. Here, we're using an incrementer that's going to change as we loop through this for loop, so it has to be let. But use const wherever you can. And if you do that and create all these files and do that repetition, here it's just 8 times, but even just doing that 8 times, you'll start to really get comfortable with this syntax of the immediately invoked function and the use strict, and you'll start to get used to using const and let instead of var for your keywords. And that will really help you out in the long run.